I want to address a very serious problem that we've been facing since the 1800s in our Christian community, in churches, in our own personal lives concerning the scriptures. I'm going to use the book of Daniel as an example. In the 1800s, the Bible came under criticism for not being legitimate, not being authoritative, not being historically accurate, as being just some kind of fabrication. This permeated into the colleges, the seminaries, which where the pastors were trained, the teachers were trained. They came out having zero confidence in the text of Scripture, but they tried to maintain Christianity for the next 120 years without the authority of Scripture. And so what they had to do is base it on society, based on their own opinions, and just try to imitate what they had handed down to them in rituals. This is very dangerous because there's no power in rituals. There's no power in imitating culture. There's power in the truth. There's power in reality. There's power in God's revelation of himself. So now we have as the book of Daniel as an example. The book of Daniel came under criticism as not being authentic. In fact, I've got right here from the Wikipedia about the book of Daniel. I just got a few quotes here just to give you an example. It's still today. It comes out of the 1800s. It's been proven to be false as far as these accusations, but it has been updated. It has been updated in many areas. There's entire denominations that are still in the darkness concerning archaeology and the proof of scriptures being authoritative. Nonetheless, the book of Daniel, the Wikipedia says, was compiled shortly after 164 BC. That would be wrong because it's supposed to have been written between 605 and 538 BC during Daniel's lifetime. 164 BC was the Maccabean revolt. So now you're putting it way out of context. You're 375 years ahead in the future, and you're writing it as if it were just copying history, and it's not authoritative. It's just a man fabricating an encouraging work to encourage the people during the time of a revolt. If that's true, we have a problem because Jesus is going to read the book of Daniel as if Daniel were a real person writing a real book. In fact, he's going to base some of his teaching on this book of Daniel. Paul likewise gets his eschatology from the book of Daniel, and many references to in his writings to the Thessalonians and other places are from the book of Daniel. Then, of course, you got John writing the book of Revelation that is completely laced with images and figures and examples from the book of Daniel. So you basically wipe out your entire New Testament, Gospels and New Testament letters, if you do not embrace the book of Daniel as authoritative. And many, many churches have, and thus they're in the position they are today. But it goes on and says, the story of Belshazzar's feast is historical fiction. This is not true. We can prove that. But they say this. This is not 1800s material. This is 1800s information, but it's being put on Wikipedia today. I've got many examples. I mean, it's not new. It's not hard to find. And several details are not consistent with historical facts. Belshazzar is portrayed as the king of Babylon and the son of Nebuchadnezzar, though he was actually the son of Nabonidus, who was the king of Babylon. And so we'll explain all this. These are accusations that are unfounded. These are like just a fraction of the story without any information backing this up. They just want to destroy the text of Scripture, the authority of the Scriptures. And churches go along with it. And then they make God and church and religion and truth in their own image, or the image of their culture. That way it's easier for them. And he never became king in his own right. In the story, the conqueror who inherits Babylon is Darius the Mede, but no such individual is known in history. Well, that was his throne name. Daniel knew him. Daniel records it. We can show you through other writings, or these cuneiform writings. The invaders were actually Persians, true. This is typical of the tale of court contests in which historical accuracy is not essential. Again, that's what they're saying. Indeed, court fantasies took place when they're trying to tell legends and stories. That took place, but the book of Daniel cannot be that. Otherwise, your Christian faith is nothing more than a court legend and someone out trying to tell somebody else in a storytelling contest. So what we've got here is some information that proves that the book of Daniel was not written during the Maccabean revolt, but was readily available already by 164 during the Maccabean revolt. And we're going to put it back in the historical context. First of all, very rapidly, the Qumran community. These were people who lived out by the Dead Sea during the time of Jesus, during the New Testament time, up until 70 AD when the Romans came through. They were a scribal community. There's a scriptorium there that's been excavated where they did all their writing. They copied scrolls. They copied the text of Scripture, including the book of Daniel. They were then hidden in jars in caves, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves there by the Qumran community. There are 8 scrolls, or fragments of scrolls, of the book of Daniel. But also there's 9 of the book of Exodus, 8 of Deuteronomy, 4 of Genesis and Isaiah, for example. The point being, by this time in the 1st century, the book of Daniel is already being copied as if it's part of the Old Testament canon of Scripture, just like we assumed it would be. They've got, for example, several scrolls. One of the scrolls is scroll 4Q Dan C, which is the title of the document, the fragment, was written in 125 BC, or copied in 125 BC. Now there's a difference between the original writing and then the copies that are being made. I'm saying that the book of Daniel was written between 605 and 538 BC. Critics want to say it was written in 164, 165 BC. If that's when it was written, that means they're making a copy of it as if it were scripture in 125 BC. 30 years later, they've already put it in line with the books of Moses and the things they've had for centuries, and copying it at the Qumran community as if it were scripture. In fact, they've got 8 copies of it, and Genesis, they've only got 4. So the point being there, that doesn't make sense, that they would rush through the editing, the texting, text adjustments and everything that they claimed it took place. So it's got to give it proof that it was already in line. Another example would be the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Around 250 BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus, the pharaoh, not the pharaoh, but the king of Egypt, he was a Greek ruler coming out of the Alexander's divided kingdom. He was ruling and building a library. He wanted the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek, so he asked for them to be copied or translated in 250. That would mean the book of Daniel would have been copied, translated in 250 BC, if it was part of the text of Scripture. We would assume it would be, but the critics say, well, it wasn't. But the problem that we've got now for the critics is that in 132 BC, we actually have the text from the Septuagint of the book of Daniel already having been translated in 132 BC, which would give the impression it wasn't just written in 164, 165. It had been written before that for it to be translated into Greek out of the Hebrew Scriptures. So once again, the Septuagint doesn't line up that it was the book of Daniel was written during the Maccabean revolt. That would push it back where it's supposed to be, in between 605 and 538. We've got many other examples. Mattathias, the founder of the Maccabean revolt, he tells his sons to be courageous and strong like the Hebrews that were in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then uses Daniel in the lion's den as an example. If these things are being fabricated at that time, how can he be using it as an example from Scripture for his sons to be strong and courageous? Again, a strike against the Maccabean revolt period of the time being written. Greek and Persian words appear in the book of Daniel. And so the critics say, well, you see, it couldn't have been written until the time of the Greeks, which would be, after 136 or 336 BC, when Alexander conquered the Persian Empire that had conquered the Babylonians. But that is blinding yourself to the fact that the Greeks were involved with the Mesopotamian world going way back to the 1400 BC time. For example, the Sea People who invaded Egypt and invaded where the Ugaritic texts were written along the coast of Canaan. They were from Crete. They are Egyptians, not Egypt. They are Europeans. In fact, this last year, DNA testing of the bones of, for example, the Philistines, who are the remains of the Sea People that settled along the coast of Israel in the Philistine territory, their DNA is European. So the Europeans from Greece were already there with their culture, with their language, with their style of war, which ties you right into why Goliath was fighting David the way he fought. That's another story. But the Sea People coming in 1400 to 1100 BC were coming over from Greece. The Assyrians had the Greeks pay taxes in the 700s because they had moving up towards the Greek territory. The Greeks served as sailors in the Assyrian Empire in the 700s, 700s. Nebuchadnezzar fought Egypt at Carchemish, and in the excavation there, they found a Greek shield. So there's a mercenary fighting there in that battle, in the Greek battle there. So the Greeks were involved with the Mesopotamian world long before Alexander shows up. So that's not even an example. The big example here is Belshazzar, who's supposed to be a fictional character. This flips the whole argument on its side for the critics. Belshazzar is only recorded until the 1800s in the book of Daniel. He's the last king. He's at the party where Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin was written on the wall by the hand, and then no one could read it. They're having a party that the land is being overrun by Cyrus, and the Persians are coming, and nothing's left of this kingdom except, Babylon and the walls. And the hand comes down and writes, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, Mene, meaning measure of weight, Tekel meaning to weigh, and then Upharsin means to divide or break in two. And Daniel comes in, Belshazzar's mom comes into the room and asking what the commotion is. She would have been Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. Her name was Nitocris. And she says, you need to find Daniel to interpret this for you, because Daniel used to help your father, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, many years ago while she was a child growing up. And Daniel was brought in. Remember, he's an 80-year-old man at this time. He was thrown in the lion's den as an 80-year-old, not as a teenager. He came over to Babylon as a teenager, but he wasn't thrown into the lion's den until the Persian Empire. Nonetheless, he explains the meaning. It means you've been weighed, you've been measured and found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided in two and handed over to the Persians. Nonetheless, the fact that Belshazzar's name is written there and nowhere else in history, the critics came against it, saying this was just a legend, this was just a fable. Until in the 1800s, there are several things that were found. We've got right here the Cyrus cylinder. This was written by Cyrus, and in this right here, he records Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar being in the kingdom. That was recorded in 539 but found in 1879. This is a replica. I've seen this in person myself. This right here is the Nabonidus cylinder. This was written in 540 BC and discovered in 1854. And on this, very clearly, I can read right here something. It's written in cuneiform on here. This was like the upgrade for the clay tablet. It was just a flat piece of clay that they'd write on. They began to write in cylinders, so they could roll it like this. It's kind of like scrolling through your iPad. This is like the updated technology of a rolling cylinder to write on. Nonetheless, this actually says, as for me, Nabonidus, that would be the king of Babylon, and it says, King of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead, and grant me as a present a life long of days. And as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart. Now, nonetheless, this mentions Belshazzar right there, who was unknown in history until 1854. And also, we've got the Babylonian Nabonidus Chronicle, which is part of the Babylonian Chronicles that was written in 556 of 539, discovered in the 1800s, and there again it mentions Nabonidus, the king, who went south into Arabia for 10 years, leaving Belshazzar, his son, on the throne to rule and reign. So there's documentation that explains what was taking place that Daniel saw firsthand. Now, the reason it wasn't recorded in history, except in that day on these documents of these cylinders and in the clay tablets, and in Daniel's writing, was Daniel was an eyewitness, as were these people. So that's a flip, meaning this has to only have been written by someone who actually saw these things take place. The fact that Nabonidus is called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, it's the word bar, which is useful. For example, right here on this Shalmaneser's, the black obelisk, you've got Jehu bowing in front of Shalmaneser on there, and on the top it says, son of Omri, which Jehu was not the son of Omri. Jehu actually destroyed Omri's dynasty and took over his throne. So that way, the word son is being used of the one who's the successor, the one who's sitting on the throne. And that's what Jehu was doing here, and that is what Belshazzar was doing in the story of Daniel. He was sitting on his father's throne, Nebuchadnezzar's throne. He was the son, and actually was his grandson through his mom, Nitocris. Now, these are examples of how we know the book of Daniel to be historically accurate, not something fabricated in the Maccabean period. But the most important point is Jesus refers to this when he talks about the signs of Daniel and the things that were in Daniel. Jesus refers to this. So to understand Jesus, you've got to embrace the book of Daniel. To understand Paul and his teaching, you're going to have to embrace the book of Daniel. To understand Revelation, you're going to have to embrace the book of Daniel. To nullify and say there is no authenticity to the book of Daniel, that it's just a fabrication, wipes out the Gospels. It wipes out Paul's teachings, wipes out the book of Revelation and John's writings. It leaves you powerless, toothless. You're neutralized in your New Testament understanding, and you are going to be left to creating Christianity, God, in the image of your own imagination or something that matches your culture, and that's where we're at. That is our problem. We do not embrace the revelation of God, His reality, His truth. We've pushed that aside, and now we're embracing culture's reality, what we feel, looking for some mystical relationship. You do not need a mystical relationship with God. You need to understand the truth of His revelation, already recorded by the apostles and the prophets who He spoke to. You understand this, you'll understand God. You keep following your mystic visions and feelings, you're going to get lost and more lost as time continues through our next few years of this culture. More about this later. This is a foundational teaching on the authenticity of the book of Daniel, so I can say some things I want to say in the next few days.